So there is this kind of clash between the desire to have things in public institutions and the advantage of having it in private hands. And the example that comes to mind is the which recently sold. It was the most expensive book ever sold, $38.1 million. The Sassoon Codex. So I went
Hmm.
to Geneva in 2019 and examined it in when it was in the hands of the private collector.
Oh, wow, what a
And
treat.
yeah, it really was. It was amazing.
Wow.
And um, and then it was sold, but it was bought by a private person who then donated it to the Anu Museum in Tel Aviv. The Anu Museum didn't have $38.1 million, but there was
Yeah,
some private collector who did. And he said, I don't know what he said, but presumably he said something like, I'm not getting this for me. I'm getting this because I want it in it's part of the national heritage of the Jewish people. It should be in Israel. I guess that was his thinking. I don't really know. And I understand that, but so here's an interesting thing, like a consideration. So just something to think about. So I've been to a lot of libraries where they have priceless manuscripts and sometimes priceless books that are printed. Sometimes an early printed book could be more expensive than a manuscript.
yes,
Like the earliest printing of the Talmud is worth more than most manuscripts because there's only one copy.
yeah,
It's from 1520, I want to say 24, sometime around then,
wow,
1521. And they only made like 300 copies or something, and there's no other complete copies. So there's one copy at the Hebrew Union College. So I remember when I was there in Cincinnati at the Hebrew Union College, and I didn't. People could find the interview I did here on Nehemia as well on my website. So the librarian, he explained to me. He said, we made a very conscious decision when we put in the fire suppression system. We could have put in halon gas, but because they have this massive vault, and when I say vault, it's not like what you think of a bank vault, right? It's like it's a warehouse basically that has
yeah,
reinforced concrete or whatever.
yeah.
So it's a vault, right, with a blast door kind of thing. Um, okay, when there's a fire, you can use halon gas, and all the artifacts will be preserved. But anybody who remains in this vault after something like 90 seconds will be dead.
Yeah.
And so we made the decision, he told me, to use water, which will destroy the artifacts, but it will save human life.
Hmm.
Now, is that a wrong decision? Well, I don't know. But it is a consideration. There could be some kind of false alarm, even, right? It doesn't even have to be a real fire. And all those artifacts are going to be soaked and maybe damaged beyond repair.
Well, and that's one of the other things to consider about institutions versus private collectors is there's this false narrative that private collectors don't know how to handle items, they don't know how to preserve them, they damage them. But the truth of the matter, at least in my experience and all the serious collectors that I know, is that when you've paid serious money for something and you have
Yes.
skin in the game, and you personally have 5 grand in that item, you have a very different level of protectiveness over it than somebody who works for an institution. And so the idea that private collectors are not protecting their items is flat wrong. And I would say that there is much more mishandling of items that happens by nature in large institutions, because there are so many people that are there, and they don't all have the same incentive that a collector does. Not just financial, but when you're deciding you're going to buy a letter that somebody should have thrown away and spent $5,000 or $10,000 for, you really believe in that piece of history and it fulfills a larger narrative. And so you naturally are going to handle it accordingly. And unfortunately, as you get into large institutions, there are so many examples. I mean, the British Museum just lost thousands of items that got sold on eBay by one of their employees. But the mishandling and the fact that you have items that sit in museums in drawers for hundreds of years, that type of thing is what causes some of that damage. And so the idea that collectors aren't as good at protecting them is just not true.
So here's another consideration. So one of the librarians at the Bodleian Library in Oxford said to me, he said, how did he say it? He said, we're asset rich, but cash poor, right? Meaning
Hmm.
we have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of manuscripts, in particular, he was talking about, but we don't have the money to, if a particular manuscript needs restoration or it should be photographed at high resolution, we need someone to come and donate that because we don't have hundreds, you know,
Yep.
the tens of millions of dollars that it would take to restore these things. Right? We have artifacts that have been, manuscripts in this case that have been there at this library for 400 years. It's really
Yeah.
interesting. So some of the manuscripts there when they were purchased weren't that old, but the
Yep.
library's been there for so long. Now they're old and unique, right? If they
Hmm.
bought, a Torah scroll that was maybe, 100 years old at the time, which, you could buy a 100-year-old Torah scroll on eBay. It's not a big deal today, right? And when they bought it, it wasn't that big of a deal. But now it's a 500-year-old Torah scroll, and
Yeah.
there aren't that many of those, um, because the Jewish practice was to actually bury them in a cemetery when they were no longer useful.
Interesting.
Yeah, so yeah, it's interesting. We actually have fewer Torah scrolls than we have codices. Codex is like a book form.
Yep.
So Torah
Hmm.
scrolls are relatively rare because they were this ritual object. When people were done with them, they were meaning they couldn't be used anymore because the ink was flaking off or something, or the rules had changed of how to write them, and so they were no longer considered kosher. They would
Okay.
bury them in a cemetery. Um, I actually, oh man, I was at this lecture about a year ago, and this librarian from Lithuania told me how after the Soviet Union fell, these rabbis came from Israel, and they had hundreds of non-kosher Torah scrolls at this library, and they said,
Mm.
okay, the proper thing to do is to bury these in the cemetery. And I was horrified because
Wow.
we don't know, are those 500,000-year-old Torah scrolls? We have no idea. Or is it a 100-year-old Torah? And even if it's a 100-year-old Torah scroll, 300 years from now, that's going to be very rare. And you
Yep.
already had it in a so here a public institution said, we want to be sensitive to the, let's say in this case, the religious sensitivities of a ethnic minority that used to live in this country, and there aren't too many
Hmm.
left, right? So we don't know what to do with it. All the Jews have been
Yeah.
killed or they fled. And so they're like, okay, what do you guys do with an old Torah scroll? Well, we bury
Yeah.
it. Okay, I understand why they do that. And so here we have to balance like religious sensitivities with
Mm.
uh, like historical importance of something, right?
Yep.
And a public institution might not be suited for that. A private collector would say, oh, okay, I just paid $1,000 for that Torah scroll. I'm going to
Yep.
preserve it the best I know how, at least.
Guaranteed. And not only that, but I think that that's another thing that a lot of people don't consider is that when you nationalize any type of collectible and you say, okay, all of this belongs to the government and all of it's going to be controlled, or a single organization or whatever the case may be, unfortunately, there becomes an ability there to manipulate what the history says.
Mm.
And as much as you want
Oh,
to
wow.
believe that nobody will ever do that, life is long, time is long, governments change, things happen. And so when you have all of this history that's in government institutions, you open yourself up to the opportunity of somebody down the road, however long, changing the history because there's no dissemination of that. And there's no way to refute it because everything's in a single institution's hands. And
Mm.
so democratizing that and allowing it to be dispersed throughout the collector community is a hedge against authoritarian regimes or religious leaders or whatever the case may be trying to change the history by controlling the artifacts. And that has happened numerous times. I mean, how many times have we seen book burnings and,
So,
like we were talking about
yeah,
destroying statues, but that's one of those things that a lot of people don't consider is they're like, well, the government will protect them. Be like, well, maybe this government. What about in a
yeah.
hundred years?
Right. Well, I mean, so an example that I experienced, um, was so I went to in China. There's this ancient Jewish community that's been there somewhere between 800 and 2,000 years, right? At a minimum of 800
Fascinating.
years. And there are these three stelae, these stone monuments written in Chinese, giving their history. They were written in the I want to say the 1500s or thereabouts, and they're in a museum in China. And I went there, and I asked to see them, and they weren't on display. They're up in this attic, and they're like, we don't let people see this. This isn't part of the museum. It's not for public consumption. and they eventually let me in there, and they wouldn't let me even take a single photo. I'm like, this is really strange. Like,
Yeah.
like, why are they hiding this part of the history of, I mean, there's 300 Jews today in China.
Because it doesn't fit their narrative.
Well, no, it actually is dangerous to them. So
Mm.
China has a majority population called the Han, Han. The Han, like most people haven't heard of those, but Han is the main ethnic group of China. It's 92% of the population, but that's a story the government tells. They say there's 55 ethnic minorities plus the Han, who are the majority. So 8% of the population, which is right tens of or hundreds of millions of people, I don't know,
Yeah.
is the um, is the minority, right? And they only recognize 55 ethnic minorities. In reality, there's thousands of ethnic minorities.
I was going to say those numbers don't make sense. I mean,
No, well,
that's
it doesn't even
ridiculous
make
over
sense
that.
according to the official Chinese narrative, because they
Yeah.
say Taiwan is part of China, and Taiwan has the indigenous population, which isn't Han, and they're not included in the 55. So even
Yeah.
from that, there's more than
Yeah.
55.
Yeah.
But that's like somebody didn't think about Taiwan when they came up with the 55 number, right? And
Yeah.
among those 55, some of those are multiple ethnic groups that don't have very little to do with each other and consider themselves different groups. So here's what China's really thinking. They're worried if we recognize there's a Jewish minority, that means there's other Jewish minorities that we haven't or excuse me, other minorities we haven't recognized. And maybe they'll say one day, I don't want to be part of China. I want my own state. Now the 300 Jews
Yeah.
aren't going to say that because they're
Yeah.
not even a
Yeah.
single building in China would be more than 300 people. Um, but there's ethnic minorities of millions of people who are considered Han, and they're considered Han, so they don't say, wait a minute, why am I being
Yeah.
ruled by this imperialist power in Beijing? Um, we're this group that's been here for thousands of years. We should have our own country, right? That's what they're really afraid of. So because of that, they're suppressing this pathetic group of 300 Jews who wants to
Yeah.
embrace their history and be part of a larger, Jewish world. So there's an example where literally the only documents are in government hands.
Hmm.
We actually have lithographs of those from before the communist revolution, so we know what it says, right? But it'd be nice to get a modern high resolution photo and see maybe the guy who transcribed it, 100 years ago or whatever, made a
Yeah.
mistake, and maybe they have the wrong century or the wrong dynasty because they wrote the wrong character, right? We know more today, or somebody
Yep.
knows about Chinese today than they did 100 years ago. But we can't do that because the government wants us to suppress that. And another example that comes to mind is in the book 1984, which,
I love that book.
oh my God, everybody needs to go read that book. It's really an important book for today, I think.
Take you a day to max. Yep, it's a great book.
It's amazing. So the one of the main storylines there is the main character works in the government archives of the newspaper, and it's his job to change history. So
Hmm.
there are these three different, superpowers and government, countries, and the alliances keep shifting. And when the alliance shifts, he has to go and burn the old newspaper articles and rewrite them to say,
Yep.
well, we're at war with East Asia. We've always been at war with East Asia. We've never been
Yep.
allies, even though last year we were allies, and it says that in the newspaper. But let's
Hmm.
destroy the archives and get rid of them so that people think we've always been. And who's going to go check the government archives, right? Or
Yep.
the newspaper archives. It's such a, but just in case anybody goes to check that, we have to literally rewrite history because we have a monopoly on these historical sources. So yeah, so I see what you're saying. That's a
Well,
really
and I think you can tell how impactful it is by how much energy is spent trying to destroy past histories. When you look at when you look at the way fascism came into Europe, and you look at the communist revolution, and you look in the immediate aftermath of how much culture was destroyed, it shows you how much power it has, because when they devote that much energy to destroying the history, it shows you how impactful it can be. And it should make us even more interested in making sure that these items are dispersed as widely as possible, because that's the only true hedge against exactly that kind of manipulation. And it can happen anywhere in the world. That kind of concentration leads us to the possibility of history being changed in order to fulfill somebody's narrative.